Hi, Dick Rauscher here. Welcome back to the Stony Hill Nuggets. Today we're going to be talking about nugget number 263. This is going to be an article on the difference between leaders and rulers. People tend to follow leaders. They tend to want to walk away from rulers, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. This article is a little bit focused on the 2016 elections, and this article is designed to kind of give you a different way to think about the election. But what I'm trying to do here with this article is to kind of cut to the chase and really look at what's important in terms of who we elect as a leader in our country, okay? So let's take a look at it. This article is based on a book called Neither Wolf Nor Dog. It was written by Ken Nerburn, and it's about the Native American elder Dan. This is an excellent book. I really encourage people to read it. You'll walk away with a different understanding of not only Native American history and some of the things that happened back then, but more importantly, you get the wisdom of an old Native American elder and the way he thinks, and it's really, really powerful. I found this book fascinating. I think most people will. Let's take a look at the difference between leaders and rulers. What we've got, according to Dan, is that leaders tend to manifest what he calls good anger. And what is good anger? Really simple. Good anger comes from careful seeing, in other words, really paying attention to what's going on, not in terms of thinking about through the world through our belief systems, but actually listening, carefully paying attention to both ourselves and the reality around us. Because if we want to speak clearly about issues, then we have to understand them and see the reality, be willing to accept what is. When we try to push away what is, I call that pushing the river, okay? Never works, never works. Leaders don't try to push the river. Now, rulers, on the other hand, tend to manifest what he calls bad anger. He calls that the need to be right. It's child anger. You see it in children a lot. These folks, the rulers, are drunk on their vision, and it's always a rigid vision. In other words, that's always put forth in the imperative voice of absolute truth, okay? So they're drunk on the rigid version of their truth. I love the way Dan talks about it. And that's exactly how he describes rulers, okay? They tend to be drunk on their own truths. Some people would say that they're drunk on their own ego, and the ego has an inflated view of one's self-importance. Rulers tend to get caught in that stuff. They tend to be very self-focused, and they blame others for their own limitations and failures, okay? They also exhibit very little self-awareness, okay? So what Dan is trying to talk about here in terms of leadership, again, is really simple. People have a tendency to follow leaders and they walk away from rulers. Now, why is that? Because the rulers need to rule. Listeners are focused on leading. They listen to the needs of all the people. Rulers, on the other hand, are more interested in power, wealth, prestige, fame, and they tend to take away or ignore the rights of all the people. They tend to look at specific groups of people or categories of people, and the rulers kind of play to those groups. Leaders include all the people. That's why they're leaders, and that's why people follow them. fascinating way to think about it in terms of how the tribes would have worked 100, 150 years ago. And what he's saying is that these are basic truths. People don't follow leaders or follow rulers. I mean, they follow leaders. So what's the difference between the two? Very simple. Leaders tend to walk a middle path. In other words, they're always looking for the truths on both sides of every issue. They recognize that no one's smart enough to be right or wrong 100% of the time. So every issue always has some truths on both sides. Leaders look for those truths, okay? Rulers are always driven by ideological extreme beliefs. Again, put out in the imperative voice of absolute truth. So when we talk about middle path leaders, Dan says they are keepers of the flame. They're the keepers of light. Or in this case, they're the keepers of the light of democracy. In other words, what this country was founded on. So a leader is always a keeper of the flame. When we get into rulers, there is no compromise. And when we have no compromise, we get gridlock. We see this a lot in Congress right now. And we end up with a lot of conflict. In other words, if you get two people on opposite sides of an issue and they both lock up, they're going to start to bump heads. And that's going to cause a lot of conflict. Dan says, if you want to avoid that kind of conflict, then you have to be willing to compromise. And rulers typically don't. Okay? So in a nutshell, that's the difference. These are people you want to follow. They're keepers of the flame. I use the definition of the flame would be our values. In other words, what are the values in our country? They tend to be keepers of that light, and they focus on our values. Rulers, not so much. Okay? So that, in a nutshell, there's a little bit more in the article on some of the details here, but on an overview, this is kind of what the article is about. Now, I think it's pretty important for us going into our 2016 election. We need leaders, not more rulers. We have more than enough rulers who speak in the imperative voice of absolute truth. We don't need any more of those. We need people who can lead.